can we be less hindered? Can we allow ourselves to receive the gift of God, to drag less stuff around with us that doesn't help our faith? And that's what we're talking about.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. We are overjoyed today to begin a new series here as we kick off this series we've called Unhindered. Every Thursday now for the next few weeks, we're going to be reflecting on spiritual health, our spiritual lives, and what we as people of faith can do to not only be aware of our current spiritual health, but what we can do as we enter into this new season. We're releasing this here in the beginning of 2022. And so with that comes an opportunity to try to sort of look above the fray a little bit and to ask some questions about how are we doing in our spiritual health. And we look forward to sort of laying out today the framework of where we kind of think we're going to go in the next few weeks.
Yeah, to some extent, we're piggybacking on the cultural movement that happens in early January every year when people make some assessments of the year to come and what they hope to accomplish. And we know that most resolutions last for a little while and then kind of fall by the wayside. But our thought is that as we enter this year, it's a good time to look at an area of life that we sometimes leave unexamined. You know, we often think of our spiritual life as something that either is on or off, and we don't always think of it in terms of degrees of health. And so I think that as we undertake this series, as we kick it off today, we want to explore, first of all, what it means to be spiritually healthy. How do we determine that? And how, if we determine there are places in our spiritual life that are unhealthy, how do we address that? And that really forms the backdrop for most of this series. And I think the opportunity in it is for each of us to kind of be challenged to imagine areas, to examine areas in which there might be some opportunities for growth.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, maybe as we kick off this conversation, it's worth just taking a moment to lay some foundation here, Clint, because the idea of health is an interesting one to bring up in the present moment. 2022, we've now had this idea of pandemic and sickness and disease that's just dominated conversation and culture now for more than a year and a half. And so I think as we come to a conversation about spiritual health, we inherit a little bit of baggage from that, if we're going to be honest, to say that in some ways people are sick about talking about health. They're sick about talking about all of the different regimens and things that should be and can be done. And then you put that on top of those who have just had negative experiences with health from the start, people who, for whatever reason, have struggled with, maybe it's a genetic disease, or people who've struggled for a long period of time. For some people, my point is, coming to a conversation about health comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of self-guilt, comes with a lot of struggle, comes maybe even with a lot of struggle in your own emotional kind of strength. Like, I don't have the energy to deal with another health thing. And when we come to this conversation, Clint, that's not what we mean. We don't mean add another thing on top of a list of other things. Rather, to ask a question about, in this moment, can I be reflective about my spiritual life, about my faith, about the depth of that faith, about the strength of that faith? Are there places where I could take real actions that would help me to grow deeper into that faith? And the health here framework, I think, is really helpful because it reminds us that our spiritual life is real. It's grounded in something, but it's not a conversation about guilt and about adding another diet to your life or however you think of health. We mean this in the most open-armed, welcoming kind of invitational way, and I hope you'll hear it that way.
Yeah, I think health is a pretty helpful framework, Michael, because just as in our physical health, there are dimensions to our spiritual health. We may be very strong. We may be very healthy in one area, And yet we may have another area in our life where we have growth. We may have some pains in our spirit, some of which we didn't create, just as we inherit genetically some medical predispositions. Some of our health is under our control, some of it is not. But even then, our response is something that we have some input in. And I think the same is true of our spirits. There are some wounds that we didn't give ourselves, that some of us have to unpack, and some of us have to deal with, and some of us have to respond to. In other cases, we've done some of the damage ourselves. We've created patterns, or we've created ways of doing things which have, built some barriers to spiritual health in our life. And we want to be able to talk about those. I think maybe to start with is, especially given what you've said, we are a little tired. I mean, we have talked a lot about physical health. So what does spiritual health look like? What is it that we're aspiring to achieve? What is it that we're chasing? And I think, for the Christian, clearly, we hold up the person of Jesus. What is it for us to grow into a deeper understanding of who Jesus is, a deeper reflection of who Jesus is, and a more full discipleship as we seek to follow Jesus. And as we do that, as we talk about how we get healthier, unfortunately, that means we do have to talk about what are the things that get in the way.
Yeah, right. The reality here is, Clint, and we're going to have to tackle this right away, is, we come towards quickly, maybe a little too easily sometimes, towards like discipleship. And I think it is connected to this thing that you're raising, that as we look to what it means as Christians to have healthy, and what I mean by healthy is really vibrant spiritual lives, we have to tackle this word discipleship, because as Christians, we believe that our spiritual life grows with the indwelling of the Spirit. Some spiritual traditions conceive of us being emptied, sort of getting the nasty out. Christians have historically understood that to be a process of indwelling, that God comes into us by the power of the Holy Spirit. We see that language of the Spirit coming all throughout the New Testament, and Christians have read that historically to mean that as we come closer to the Creator, Redeemer, Savior, that what that means is that these other things that hold us back, what we would call unhealthy parts of our spiritual life, that they will naturally be pulled away from us. Now, naturally doesn't mean easily or painlessly. I mean, I think C.S. Lewis, some of his books, describes how sometimes leaving behind the painful spiritual things that we have inherited or that we have taken upon ourselves can be very difficult. But yet, those things go in the same measure that Jesus Christ indwells and lives and works within us. And so when we use a word like discipleship, what we mean is that our physical lives, our practices, our words, our actions, our priorities, which are reflected in our daily lives, that these things begin to more and more look more like the person of Jesus, because that is an outward reflection of a spiritual and inward truth. In other words, as he becomes more real within our lives, and he becomes the eyes through which we see the world, he becomes the hands which we touch the world. These are very biblical images. When this happens, then our discipleship has increased. We become more like the one who lives in us. And that is a full measure of what we would mean by spiritual health. It would mean that the more and more it's reflected in our daily lived lives, then this is a reflection of an inner thing that has become more and more true for us.
And I think, Michael, that creates one of the places that the health metaphor, or the health framework, is maybe less helpful, because when we aspire to be physically healthy, that's generally about us. We'd like to live longer. We'd like to live without pain. We'd like to enjoy what we do longer before it's compromised by health challenges. When we talk spiritual health, yes, there is a benefit to us. Yes, we hope that our personal discipleship will grow, but really the point of our spiritual health is outside of ourselves. It's our relationship with others. It's primarily our relationship to God through Jesus Christ. It is something that is internal, but is far more external than our physical health. And maybe that's where some of the comparison breaks down. But I think it's important on the front end to understand that as we talk about what it means to be spiritually healthy and some thoughts on how we might all get there, or at least take steps that direction, that's not primarily so that we can be, quote unquote, healthier or better. It's so that we can be more faithful. It's so that we can practice discipleship more fully. It's so that we can serve more faithfully, that we can embody joy more completely. It certainly benefits us, but it is not primarily about us.
Yeah, right. So I want to maybe take a moment here. You'll see if you're watching the video, the title of this series is Unhindered. And actually, there's a whole series of conversations behind this, whether we should have named it this or not. We gave some thought to it, because in some ways, calling this series Unhindered is a little bit of false advertising. In other words, we don't really believe that at the end of our time together, that either Clint or myself or you joining us in this conversation, that we're going to be completely unhindered of the things that holds us back. That would be to discount the reality of the entanglements of our lives. But there's a sense in which your point here, Clint, is really well taken, that fundamentally the fruit of tending the garden of our souls is ultimately that we can weed out some of the things that we are carrying with us. And I think a metaphor that's really stuck with me is I came to the church here in Spirit Lake and got to begin working with Clint. And over that period of time, I came to know and appreciate his long history of cycling. And so at one point, he was gracious enough to help me get my own bike. And so we went through sort of the process of learning some of the things that go into a road bike versus other positions and where's the strengths and weaknesses. And I remember sort of learning early on in that conversation as I was working my way toward my own bike was how much detail and attention is given to just tiny amounts of weight that are added to a bike. It was crazy to me, Clint, this type of wheel adds a few grams, but it's probably okay in your use case. I think to myself, dude, a few grams, right? I add that in a day when I drink a glass of water, right? So what's the deal with that? And you come to learn, or I came to learn, that these small things add up. And they add up not just in the total weight of the bike, but when you figure that over 20, 30, maybe at the extreme edge, 100 or 200 miles, every single ounce of weight that you add to the bike is weight that you have to carry. You have to push it. You have to pedal it. It's something that you're physically going to have to move. And I began to realize that it's these small things that add up that can have significant impact over the long term. And so there's a few things there. One is you have to be willing to look at it for that long term. You have to understand that these small things add up. But then the second thing is you have to ask yourself some questions. Is it really worth spending 5 times as much to get a few ounces or grams off of the bike? Is that really worth it? And to move that into the spiritual conversation, there are some things that are going to require substantial work, Clint. There's no way around it. But if you're willing to see that long-term vision, it may help you be willing to bear some of the weight or some of the cost to work towards a healthier, less encumbered spiritual life. Right.
There's another, I think, very helpful kind of illustration. I used to take kids backpacking, and there's sort of an object lesson. You take a very small pebble that weighs almost nothing, and you could say, I can add this pebble to you, and it will almost break you. And of course, kids look at it and go, that thing doesn't weigh an ounce. What are you talking about?
Right.
And you say, put it in your shoe. Put that same pebble in your boot.
Right.
And within a couple miles, you're hobbled. So it's not only what affects us, but how it affects us, where it affects us. And all of us, I suspect, if we've ever tried to seriously follow Jesus, we have found ourselves hobbled in some area of our life. We are all predisposed to struggle to grow spiritually. That is built into the process. And as you say, if that's one thing here and there, but when those things add up and we carry them, we drag them around with us, and we continue to have the same deficiencies in the same areas over and over and over again, they do cumulatively create a significant burden for us, and they hamper us, they hinder us. And so this is really about, are we willing to explore where those areas might be? What could we learn from exploring that? And what could exploring that teach us about the opportunity, perhaps, to leave some things behind, to shift the pack, to, do whatever it is that might help us move forward in a better way. And I think that's the spirit that we undertake this series today.
And the reason why we sort of linger here so long is really to maybe get to this point, is to let's just be honest with one another about our anxieties here. Let's just admit this is tough work, and nobody particularly likes assessing their spiritual life. I mean, I suppose we probably would say that about most things. Most of us don't love going in for checkups to the doctor. We don't love having someone tell us our blood pressure went up, or they don't love going to the dentist to say, yeah, it's probably a cavity or worse. So there's a reality that when you come to talking about our spiritual health, the temptation might be to say, I don't really want to look at the strengths, because I might be afraid of seeing the weakness. I might be afraid of seeing the place where I need to grow, and I just would prefer not to do that. And I want to really encourage you to, first of all, know that you're not alone in that there's really no one who doesn't enter into a process that involves the deepest meaning of our lives, that doesn't do so with some timidity. I would hope that we would do that with some humility, to recognize that we don't know exactly what we're going to find. But there is great value. And value is not even exactly the right word, Clint. There is a deep kind of meaningful opportunity that comes when we open ourselves and we invite God to say, show us our strength and our relationship with you, and show me where that remains weak, where I continue to need to grow, where I may be young in my faith, where I may have a plank that needs removed so that I might serve another, right? There's a sense in which, as we look to this idea of diagnosing and trying to look at our faith from a holistic view, we need to just account for that's going to come with some tough revelations. It's going to happen. And I want to just say that. And I hope that you might be able to add your voice to that, to say it's okay. When we get there, it's going to be okay, because the same God who is with us and called us as his own is the very God who will hold you in that moment. But here's the great gift. The gift is when we see our strengths, we for a moment can see ourselves as God sees us. God sees us as the beloved, the ones who were created in his own image. And God desires in that for us to know that even as we look at those places that don't reflect that image in the way that God intends, that we can grow there too, that can be healed, it can be touched by the grace and love and compassion of Jesus Christ. And if we're willing to see that, then once again, that's an opportunity for the things that hinder us to be let go. It's an opportunity to live a more full and vibrant, not only spiritual life, but I would say life, without adjective, right? That is an absolute gift, but we have to be willing to admit, Clint, that there's going to be some struggle as we look to this idea of where are we strong and where are we weak. Right,
and I think it's a very important reminder that we do all of this under the grace of Jesus Christ. is no threat in this. There is no judgment in this. This is an exploration. This is to say, are there areas in my life that I could improve? Are there areas in my life where I'm struggling? And what would it look like to address those? Is there a pain that I'm carrying around that really isn't helping me? Are there practices, are there patterns in my life that aren't sending me in the directions that I hope to go in my faith? And if so, what might God be inviting me to do? I think it's easy in this to feel like this is about judgment. And it's easy in this to feel guilt. And guilt is an interesting gift in the church because it is helpful to the moment it convicts us. And then when we use it or when we allow it to hold us back, it's no longer helpful. The idea of guilt is to move us to a place of being ready for something else, to be convicted. But at that point, if we continue to carry it around, it really is detrimental and not beneficial. And so this isn't about feeling guilty. This is about being honest, trusting in the grace of Christ, that I am no less worthy or less loved if I admit a struggle in this area of my life than if I don't. And we live in a kind of culture of denial that likes to turn away and not admit things, not face some of the things that we don't want to see. And, this is just about, are there ways we can move past some of that? And as Michael said, we had lots of conversation about the word unhindered, but less hindered is awkward and it doesn't fit on the screen as well. But that's the idea. Can we be less hindered? Can we allow ourselves to receive the gift of God, to drag less stuff around with us that doesn't help our faith? And that's what we're talking about.
So how are we going to do that? I think that's a fair question. If you're thinking, okay, this intrigues me, I'm interested, I'm with you so far, but what does this actually mean? I think it boils down in a few very simple ways. So first of all, we're going to be each week presenting a new aspect of the spiritual life. And it's going to be wide-ranging, so every week will be different. And in that conversation, at this point, we can see that going with two major sections. So the first is we'll talk a little bit about what it looks like to be spiritually healthy, what spiritual hindrances look like in that aspect of our faith. And we'll talk just a little bit about, from a pastor's vantage, what does it look like when we're living into a good season in that spiritual aspect? And when might there be some warning signs on the dashboard? And then the idea is that about midway through, about the second part of the conversation, that we'll switch into a little bit more of a practical tool-based kind of conversation. So what are some things that you could add to your routine? What are some books or practices or maybe spiritual disciplines of the historic church that may help you in this area? And the goal in that is to connect from the idea of, well, what does it look like to diagnose our spiritual strength or weakness or health or sickness, or however you want to frame that in the first part, to say, okay, now what can we do in the second? And the flow of that conversation is intended to provide an opportunity for you to mirror it in the week. So you start with a reflective question. How am I doing in this part of my spiritual health? And then that can lead you to an opportunity to either add or affirm or strengthen the practices and tools that you may have at your spiritual disposal. And the idea would be it becomes for you a living opportunity to live into this new year, not only with some new ideas, but maybe even with some new practices that come out of those ideas.
And this is where, Michael, I think the health framework is very helpful, because if you go to the doctor for a checkup, they're going to look at several areas. They're going to take your pulse. No, that seems very good. They're going to check your blood work. They may come back and say, hey, blood sugar's a little high. Let's cut a few things out of the diet, but it's not. Or they may say, hey, there's a significant issue here we need to talk about. It may be something as simple as, hey, you know what? You gained a few pounds. Why don't you add a walk a day? Well, can you walk a mile a day for the next season and see how that happens? And to get there has to be a kind of checklist, a kind of inventory. And so each week we want to provide as helpfully as we can an inventory in that area. If we're talking, as we will next week, prayer and study. How do we evaluate our lives, our spiritual lives, through the lens of how much time and effort in a productive way do we invest into praying and studying Scripture? How can we improve there? And it may be, that looks really good. You may take that assessment and say, yeah, okay, I'm happy with that. You may say there's room for growth. You may say, boy, I've got a lot of room to work here. I need to, and it doesn't need to be fixed all at once. It's not, this isn't a kind of win the lottery thing. This is, how do we begin to practice? How do we begin to make progress? How do we begin to take small steps? You know, a lot of people derail their efforts by the idea that they have to do it all at once. You know, I'm going to lose 50 pounds this month. Well, most of us are not. Most of us need to lose a pound and then another pound. And that will be the tenor of this work. How do we identify what it is that we might have an opportunity, even a need to work on? And then some thoughts on how do we work on it. But it starts with that kind of evaluation, that checklist. And I do think in that sense, health is a very good word. It's a helpful image. And we want to try and provide that as a tool, which gives us a place to start.
So what that looks like really practically is every week we're going to create a document that you can print at home and that you can literally go through. We're going to have questions, you know, some of them rate on a scale of 1 to 5, some of them a little bit more reflective, you know, how much time have you spent doing this, and how would you rate and how would you explore or explain this part of your relationship with God or your practice with others, whatever it might be. And so the idea is every conversation is going to be paired with this physical thing that you can print and go through. And, you know, I would just really recommend, this is a great opportunity. Find a 3-ring binder somewhere in your house that's either no longer useful or, you know, pick one up if you need. But, you know, every week, 3-hole punch that and put it inside and build this up over the weeks. Fill this out. This isn't for others. We're not going to ask you to send them in to us or to share them with others. If you have a Bible study, maybe invite them to do this with you. This would be an easy conversation to come back into a group and to talk about. But realistically, the idea is this is for you. And as you do this, week by week, another piece of paper, a few short questions, a few reflective sort of opportunities. This is the amazing thing. The end of this series, right? We're going to be finishing this series right before Lent, right before, as we as a church community begin a process of introspection and spiritual reflectiveness. You will have already started a spiritual diary, is what it will become, an opportunity for you to begin building up a reflective conversation with God about your relationship and discipleship. That's the amazing beauty of a thing that happens slowly over time, is when you look back, you can see how much ground you've traveled. So I really hope, you know, part of this conversation is really to explain our process, to explain kind of what we're thinking about the weeks to come. And all of this may seem a little slow. I'll just admit this to you. The reason for that is really we're trying to invite you to commit to be part of this conversation with us. And what that commitment means, we hope, will be that you will say, I'm going to reflect on these things for myself. I'm going to print out this questionnaire. I'm going to do this survey every week. I'm going to build this spiritual diary. And in doing so, I'm going to be all in. I'm going to ask some of these difficult questions, and I'm going to see where God takes me in it. If you're willing to do that, I just am excited to see what God might do through it.
Right, and there's some good news and bad news about these assessments, the tools that we'll provide to you. The good news is we're going to ease our way into them. So we have arranged this series, we think, with the hardest things to answer, the most difficult areas later in the series. So we're going to start off as easily as we can, and that's the good news. The bad news is if you take these seriously and you take this journey with us, I can assure you that at some point there will be questions that you don't want to answer. There will be answers that you're uncomfortable with. That's why these are just for you, but in order to be effective, we each need to get to a place where we have to admit something, we have to confess something that we may not want to face. We may have to make an admission about the very thing we don't like thinking about, we don't want to talk about, we don't want to deal with. And that is both the blessing and the curse of an opportunity to wrestle spiritually with our growth, is that it will inevitably and purposefully bring us to the very place we need it most. And that is the good news and the bad news. We hope that will be down the road. We're not starting there. We're not jumping into the deep end on week 1 and week 2, but we hope that as we move our way toward that, you will be able, each of us will be able to grow into that. Because the reality is, as we talk about this health imagery, one of the things that's been, I think, during the pandemic, one of the things that's been difficult is that the COVID business has so many symptoms. Everything could be an indicator, right? Well, it pales in comparison to the symptoms of sin. The symptoms of sin in each of us are varied and multitude. And so as we face them, we will find some that we say, oh, yeah, and some that really, really convict us. And again, that's a hard thing, but it's a private thing. It's not for public. It is not intended to bring shame or guilt or pain to anyone. It is an opportunity. The doctor has to explore what hurts us the most in order to move us toward health, and the same is true spiritually.
You know, Clint, we've talked about this in other contexts. I think it applies here, and I want to encourage you as we're at the outset of a project like this, that we sometimes in the Protestant church especially have left behind a little bit of the resource of the historic church, that is to say, that we do things in community. So this is personal, it's private, and it should remain so, but there's another sense I want to encourage you to consider that maybe this is also an opportunity for you to walk alongside someone else. Maybe this is an opportunity to walk alongside a spouse, maybe a very close friend, maybe a sibling, maybe a parent. You know, this could be done as a family even. There is a gift that happens as we both are honest with ourselves and we can hear and see and affirm another person. And so I can see how for some, this conversation is going to be between you and us, the kind of private safety of putting on earphones and listening to this podcast and being part of our conversation. That is just us three, and that's great. And I hope that you will be all in with us. I could see for others that this may be an opportunity to walk alongside another person, that you're going to send them an email or make a phone call and say, hey, you know, our church is going to do this series, or our pastors are going to have this conversation. And I would wonder if you might want to tune into this first one and see if you'd be interested in doing it with me. You know, that has a kind of power of doing something with another believer, a brother or sister in Christ. And in doing that, it opens an opportunity to not just know ourselves, but to grow deeper in relationship with others. So this may need to be done differently for different people. And I just want to give you blanket permission. If you feel that that would be right for you, maybe you felt isolated in this season of COVID, maybe you felt like your spiritual life has not been as rich, then this is an opportunity to build a relationship and connection with another person. Follow as the Spirit leads, and I think that's the best that we could ever do.
Yeah, I think those are good words, Michael, and I think there is another way that this is communal in the sense that, you know, for thousands of years, men and women have sought this goal of spiritually growing, of deeper discipleship. And they have wrestled with particular sins. They've struggled with grace. They've struggled with forgiveness. They've dealt with pain and loss and grief. They have been where we are, and we have access to their journeys. Many of them have left for us very helpful practices and thoughts and ideas and theology and reminders. And we bear the blessing of having access to those. And so this won't be the kind of thing where once we identify an issue, we're on our own. We have a great deal of resources to bring to bear from our history and our heritage as people in a long line who have tried to follow Christ together. And there is, I think, something encouraging in that as much as we seek this individual growth, we do so under the umbrella of what faithful have always done for thousands of years, which is seek to be better disciples and better able to serve Christ and to allow Christ to transform more of our lives into that which is in keeping with his will and his work.
Clint, we've been having conversations. This is sort of how it happens. We sometimes sort of simmer conversations over long periods of time, and then eventually they grow into a more formal conversation in a class or a series. And I think at some point, maybe this will turn into a series, but I think it's reflected here. We've been talking a little bit about this idea of sort of therapy and mental health, and we sort of live in a culture that's very attuned to these sorts of issues. And that's an aspect of health that we've not explicitly named as part of this conversation, but it certainly intersects, right? Certainly this image, this metaphor of health is physical health, that we have that in mind. But we're doing this in a time and moment which our culture is very attuned to, personal mental health and sort of these different therapeutic sort of language. What's interesting is that we live in a moment in which our culture, not too long ago, Clint, used the word sin. People are less comfortable using the word sin than probably for the entire history of the Christian faith. And certainly as we engage this conversation, it must be done with the language of the Christian faith. That we believe inherent in this frame is real deep meaning that is mineable, that if we're willing to submit to it, it has something to teach us. That said, I do think there's something very contemporary about this conversation in the sense that when you begin to allow the language of the ancient faith to really come into the center, I think what you might be surprised to find is that these ideas that seem very contemporary about our health have been there all along. In other words, the ancient Christians are not going to be in any way surprised by some of the concerns that we bring to the faith. Like, well, how about people who, have been traumatized, or people who have in some ways heavy burdens to bear in their mental health? And you say, well, you realize that this has been a part of our ancient understanding that, when sin lives, and when we fully understand the full extent of that sin, that it does impact these other parts of our life, and that there's comfort and grace and compassion to be found for all of those who experience these things. My point here is to say that you might be surprised to discover that some of the very prescient, present, sort of demanding conversations that are at the forefront of our culture right now have very ancient sort of forebears. And though the vocabulary may in some ways seem different, you may be surprised as we have these conversations to see that this is not the first time that the church has been asked to think on these things. And in many ways, we discover in old tools that may have very present and contemporary help.
Yeah, I think we continue to live out those words of Jesus, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And we could talk about those various aspects. I think by and large in this series, we will be landing on the plate of soul. That will be kind of our guiding premise is in what state are our spirits now, and what are the indicators of areas that might need some attention, that may have a little friction right now, and how do we grow through those areas and through those challenges. We're grateful that you would be willing to take some of this journey with us, in terms of it being helpful. I think that's going to take a commitment on all of our part to be honest as we work our way through those assessments, to answer them honestly, to answer them openly, to be willing to be accurate as best we can about the areas in our life that are doing well right now, and the places where maybe there's room for growth. And I think if we can do that, then it gives us the best opportunity to know where do we need to dig in the follow-up conversations? Where do we need to put some of our time and some of our effort? And I hope that it's encouraging knowing that we join you there. That it may be a little different checklist for each of us. Your areas and our areas may not be the same, but we will all have them. I assure you, part of the reality of being human is we all have places to grow. We all have places where we're missing the mark, and we all have things that we can do to try and improve in those areas. And so I hope it's an encouragement that you will be doing this with others. You may not know who they are. In many cases, you may not know what their particular struggles are going to be. We will probably admit some of our own to you along the way, and some of them you probably know from being around us. But we will do this together, and I hope there's something that in that togetherness that provides you a sense of community and a sense of strength as we do what can be a difficult task.
Yeah, I think maybe the last word that needs said is, as we look to start this process, you can do one thing today. The one step you can take today is to get connected so that you can be part of this, however you want to get it, by audio or video. So if you're on YouTube, you would subscribe, hit that button right now. You'll get those videos. If you are someone who wants to get it by audio, go to pastortalk.co. There you can sign up for emails, or you can go to whatever app you want on your phone to get signed up for these, so that whenever the conversation comes out, it sends you a notification. If you need help doing that, we've got a little box there where you can send us a message. Do that. However, it's going to be helpful for you to really get onto the conversation ramp. Do that. And that's as easy as clicking the button right now. And certainly, if there's someone who you think who might appreciate or be encouraged by this conversation, consider sending him an email or share it on Facebook, or however is most convenient for you. Give him a phone call. The point is, friends, as we set out on this process, we do so with the awareness that come what may, we're grateful that God goes with us, and that God is always drawing us closer to that triune life, and always simultaneously drawing us closer to one another. So we hope that you'll be encouraged by that invitation, and we certainly hope that you'll commit to be part with us on the journey.
Absolutely. That same God wants for each of us that we be less hindered, that we become closer to Him, and that fewer of the things that hold us back continue to hold us back as we follow Christ together. We thank you for listening to this podcast. Our first assessment, which will be used next week, will come out very soon. It will be available on our webpage. It will be linked in all the places you listen to this. We will get that to you. You can find it lots of places. We'll make it as easy as possible. And join us next week as we begin to work our way through this series and this process, and we're grateful for your being a part of it.